After the surprise success of the first Dead Space in 2008, EA went all in on the brand, and within a very short period of time, there were 6 games. There were 3 mainline entries: Dead Space Extraction, the on-rail shooter that was initially released on the Wii; Dead Space Ignition, a puzzle-based game which served as a prequel to Dead Space 2; and finally Dead Space Mobile that served as filling out the universe between 1 and 2. With Dead Space getting a remake by Motive that is due out in January of 2023, there seems like no better time to figure out what order the games rank in the series. There are 2 ways to rank the series. The first would be the critical success, and the second would be opinion-based. Once we have those 2 methods laid out, we could try to cross-reference to find a middle ground. There is one small caveat, and that is all versions of Dead Space Mobile were taken down in 2016, 5 years after its release, which means that we will only be able to use a critical rank for that title. For the critical rank, it goes Dead Space 2, Dead Space Mobile, Dead Space Extraction, Dead Space 3, and finally Dead Space Ignition way below. And when looking at ours, it goes Dead Space 2, Dead Space Extraction, Dead Space 3, and Dead Space Ignition also way below. For the most part, the rankings are quite similar, with the main difference being that we have the original in the top spot, and the critical consensus is that the second one ranks slightly higher. Having never played Dead Space Ignition, I was interested to see if it got unfair treatment due to it being a spin-off, but after playing, it can be agreed upon that it's easily the worst entry in the series. If you want to see our full thoughts, click here. I ranked the first game higher as it left a bigger impression on me and felt much closer to a horror game. Dead Space 2 didn't change much from the original, but slightly iterated on everything the way a traditional sequel should. The formula was already in place from the first game. The other reason that Extraction is ranked above Dead Space 3 is because it still felt like a Dead Space game despite its change in perspective to first person. It was still very atmospheric and tense. The other thing is to try and figure out where the Dead Space remake is going to end up with these rankings. The original Dead Space sits only behind Dead Space 2 by 1 point with an 88. Can Dead Space Remake possibly get ranked higher than the original and the sequel? This possibility is actually pretty high, as I've been following the developer blogs during development, and they are adding plenty of modern touches like lighting, new characters, side quests, and moving to one sequential shot. The most important thing is that they are very aware of how beloved the original was, so they are making sure to keep that core intact. Dead Space Remake feels very reminiscent of RE2 Remake, which ended up scoring a few points higher than the original and ended up with an average of 91 and was one of the best games of the year. In our opinion, RE2 Remake surpassed the original, and I expect Dead Space Remake to do the exact same thing. Coincidentally, RE2 Remake was also released at the end of January.